talk about the recommendations that we're going to have for the written report after a couple of months of meetings, going over a lot of information. We're at the point now where we're gonna put together a written report for this committee to review and vote on, and then submit to the county executive. I'll go over the timeline of how that's going to happen as we go through the morning. So basically, I'm gonna share my screen here. I have a presentation that will lead us through the discussion of what we're working on here. So we have kind of four basic charges from the order from the county executive for this report. One, the first one is the projections of general fund revenues for the upcoming fiscal year. So that's fiscal year 22. Recommended level of new county debt. So this would be GO bonds, general obligation bonds, authorization. An analysis of the long-term fiscal outlook, including multi-year projections. So we're going to be looking at the information, a lot of the information that was shared last week by Holly and the team around what the projections are for revenue and expenditures over the next this year and then the next 5 years thereafter. And then any other findings under recommendations that the committee deems appropriate. So in years past, we've used this as an opportunity to talk about certain items that we felt were important enough to warrant being in the report. One of those was last year's recommendation that the Spending Affordability Committee become a year-round committee. That didn't happen, but we did get to start a little bit earlier, which I think allowed us to have a little bit deeper dive in some of these items. We didn't feel as rushed, having conversations with the different agencies and asking questions. We had more time to do that as well. So, I mean, that was a good step in the right direction. But those are some of the other findings. Another one was the transfer tax increase. That was a recommendation for the committee for a few years. So this would be any other findings or recommendations that the committee deems appropriate for the report that we put together. So, and what we'll do is I've formed a subcommittee of the committee to write the report. We met last week after the last meeting and kind of came up with like a high level outline of the items that we're looking at for this year. Kind of want to go over those and then open up the floor for any comments or suggestions from the rest of the committee members. There are a few items there that we will vote on. We'll vote on the revenue forecast. We will vote on the bond authorization, and we'll vote on the long-term fiscal outlook multi-year projections. Some of the other findings and recommendations we will talk about putting in there, and then those will be included and then voted on with the report, removed if they're not approved, those types of things. So we'll walk through this. Anybody has any questions, just please let me know at any time, and I can stop and go through. But I hope this is a good dialogue for everybody to kind of go over what we've seen and what we think is going to happen. So I'm going to move into report considerations unless there are any questions. Okay. Okay, so we've got the fiscal year 22 revenue forecast based on the report that was put together by Holly for our last meeting. The revenue forecast for fiscal year should have been, for fiscal year 22 is a $26.7 million increase, or 2.3% over the fiscal year 2021 budget. In years past, we've looked at that and said, based on what we're seeing, especially in the reports from Dr. Rani, Dr. Clinch about the economy and where we think things are going, do we agree with that 2.3% forecast, or do we believe that that should be more aggressive or more conservative? Typically, the first year of forecast is usually the one that the team here is the closest to. We are getting towards the point in time when they're going to know those numbers much more finely. But right now, they've got a 2.3% recommended increase in the budget, or expected proposed increase in the budget for fiscal year 22. Are there any suggestions on whether or not we maintain the 2.3% in our report, or have some different number that we put in there? And because we're doing this virtually, I'm going to, when I ask for a vote, I'm going to ask for no votes, just so that I think it'll be easier to do that. And I've got everybody's name down here so I can track that.
Do you need a motion, Steve?
Yeah, Barbara, that would be great. Thank you for that.
Okay. I make a motion that we accept the revenue increase of 26.7 million, or 2.3%, as our recommended amount this year.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
I will second that, Steve.
Thank you, Milton. And do we have any opposed? Okay. So we'll put 2.3% in the report. The next item on the list is the level of bond authorization for fiscal year 22. We have 3 levels here for recommendation. Obviously, anybody on the committee could suggest any level. We've just put 3 levels here, and I think I'd like to have a conversation, some dialogue around this. The way I've always looked at it in the past, and I think a number of the people in the committee over the years have looked at it as we've got a significant amount of money that's already authorized out there for different projects, and we need to weigh where we will be from all of the different debt measures, and whether or not this is the year, or any previous year, or any future year would be the year to increase that authorization. For the last few years, that authorization has been in the $70 million range, and the committee has had robust discussions around where the levels should be. And so, given all of the things that we've seen over the last couple of months, what we've seen over the last few weeks, even, are there anybody want to make a motion or have discussion around a bond authorization recommendation?
Steve, I think it might. Can you hear me, Steve?
Yeah. I can hear you.
I think it might be worth noting. I think there was some discussion in our small group about whether there should be any new construction starting during the next year or two, given so much uncertainty in our environment. I know we're all kind of rah-rahing, wanting to get back to, quote, normal, but I thought there was a sense that we should be quite conservative moving forward right now until we have a better sense.
Yeah, given the uncertainty of we know what we know, but we don't know what's going to happen soon. Is this the year to pause on new projects and only look at trying to finish some of the existing projects that are in the pipeline, and kind of take a year off? I think we had a pretty good discussion around debt authorization levels at the last committee meeting, but I remember that was kind of the sense of the discussion during the small group prepping for this meeting.
Steve, if I may.
Absolutely, Milton.
One of the concerns I have also with the bond and the bond authorization is the impact on the operating budget. I know that Holly's out there. One of the things that stands out for me is that right now, I think in either in 21 or in 22, we will be at 10% of our projected income. I think that's the number. 10% of our general operating budget expenses is tied to bond indebtedness or paying off the bonds. And so that's a concern for me, because I know that the courthouse has made an impact on our bond indebtedness and what's available to us. And also, it's my understanding there's another type of debt that's been tied in there. So that's one of the big concerns, because every time we increase our bond spending, it impacts the operating budget.
It does. I think what you're referring to is the additional dollars that are being taken out related to the increase in the transfer tax.
No, I thought Holly talked about some type of one-time grant. It was some that's being considered as a loan. We're considering it as a loan, but it impacts us when it comes to the operating budget.
Oh, WIFI loan, I think. Milton.
Yes.
That was a discussion related to the Elk City Safe and Sound Plan.
Yep.
So basically, that will be another financing tool. It's different, but in the same way in terms of incurring debt. It's different in the sense that traditional GEO bond is 20-year bond, right? We just issue the bond and get paid back. This one is a WIFI loan through the federal government. It's a 30-year term and with a more favorite interest rate, but nevertheless, it's a full face and credit from the. It's basically still a debt for the county, and we still pay principal interest. So that's just I want to make sure that's included in overall discussion, because it's also a debt, and we also pay out of our operating budget.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And by the way, I think we have people from finance in the call as well. If any questions need a more technical verification, they can help.
Thank you.
The WIFI bond is specifically related to the new the Ellicott City Safe and Sound program. Is that right?
Correct.
So, Holly, this is Leonardo. A quick question here. I'm not disagreeing with anything that's been said, but I guess one question is, I know we've heard for the last couple of years about the fact of the condition of the jail, and I guess ultimately what position does that put the county in, whether that's liability-wise or other, if we do take this position and so forth?
So there's two pieces on that. On the detention center, that actually, for that project, I actually had a conversation with facilities managers on that. And in the past several years, they actually have been making and continue to make in the next 2 years some investment to fix those critical needs on that. That will enable them to meet the federal mandates and solve some immediate security, medical unit, those kind of issues there. So with that, that's almost done in the next 2 years. Then it's just general maintenance. It will be able to carry them, based on the conversation, at least another 10 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. But then after that time, it will still need a permanent solution, as the group has been pointing out last time. So it's buy us more time. It's not a few years, it's going to be longer than that, but eventually it will still need a replacement as a wholesale solution, because that can carry us for a little while, but not permanently. In terms of overall needs, it is it's up. I want to stay neutral on the bond authorization discussion, because I kind of have fixed the feeling on the one hand on the capital side there. I do know there's a lot of needs, probably not very practical to solve. On the other side, on the operating side there, as many of you have been pointed out, that service does become a bigger share of the overall operating budget and cost of expense there. So that's just a dilemma.
I mean, should this committee, in terms of capital, this is Richard speaking, should we say something about the correction center? Because it seems like we're building all kinds of really nice things we want, like pools and schools and libraries and senior centers, but we've been kicking the can down the road on this correction center for as long as I've been on the committee. I think the first year, and I've been probably over 10 years. So should we say something about, and then Steve, you had said something about one of the reasons we had to do the courthouse and the way we did it was because we had kicked the can down the road on the courthouse, which I wasn't aware of. So should we as a committee say we need to take a real look at what we're prioritizing? Because the correction center's falling down. And if we're issuing bonds to 20-year bonds to put Band-Aids on it, we'll be paying those bonds for 10 years after we get it back. Could we, as a committee, say something about that? So we
Yeah,
don't
I
get
would
that.
certainly be. Todd here. I would certainly be in favor of that. I think we keep ignoring those needs and pursuing cool stuff that we want. And one of the things we recommended last year was that the operating costs associated with the capital projects be investigated prior to the decision to go ahead and proceed with the capital project. And to my knowledge, we haven't done that. I mean, the East Columbia Senior Center is a great example of that, where we're increasing the size of that senior center from roughly a 7,000 square foot attached structure or 7,000 square feet within an existing building to a 35,000 square foot separate building. But we had no discussion whatsoever about what the associated operating costs would be from that 5 times expansion of that facility, number one. And number two, I don't know that this year we had the same presentation from Rec and Parks as we did last year, but I thought it was interesting last year that Rec and Parks was quite clear in saying that they were not able to fill all the positions that they need to fill because they didn't have the funding for them for all their existing Rec and Parks structures and parks. Yet here we are looking at a new $20 million facility when we have a budget shortfall in operations already, and we don't even look at the operating costs associated with that $20 million structure. I think it's just kind of evidence of not very clear thinking on where we really are as a county with respect to both our operating budget and our capital budget.
I think that's, Todd, going back to what Barbara said in the conversation that we were having last week, it's one of those balls to digest maybe a little bit and just understand what the impact. Holly, in your long-term fiscal outlook, expense growth numbers, are those just long-run expense increases that are expected, or do those include increased operating expenses coming on?
Yes, we include the operating budget impact. Because what happens, we do have to ask agencies to give us an estimate about associated staffing or maintenance costs on that. So that's included there based on existing CIP. It does actually play a role in terms of kind of being part of the increase in the coming years. I think Todd and others did mention that, and his memory is correct from last year. Taking Rec and Park as an example, for years actually, because the park recreation facility has been expanding, but their operating budget didn't have all the adequate funding to fund all those, so they have been asked to absorb those costs in operating, which has been put them in a very difficult situation for years.
But one of the things that you've presented to the team is basically the projected structural deficit in the operating budget, and that's a big portion of that is due to new facilities and other things coming online that require additional operating funds that aren't in the covered in by long run revenue projections.
That is definitely part of that. Yeah.
It's not all of it, but it's part of it. We're growing expenses at a greater rate than we're growing revenue.
Right.
And building more facilities and increasing future operating costs only exacerbates that particular issue.
Yeah, that's
and I would say not only are we growing expenses this is Richard Clint speaking, at a greater rate than revenue, but at a greater level than population growth. So we're increasing spend per person by offering, by continuing to expand services as we're entering this kind of slow growth period, per capita services. So, I think we need to mention something about the fact that with, running out of land, regulatory changes, population growth is going to be lower, so therefore revenue growth is going to be lower. So the more capital we add, as Milton said and Todd said, the more we spend on housing, operating those facilities when we're going to have less people coming in, and that's what to support it.
I think one of the struggles historically for saying let's hold off on, kind of taking on new facilities or anything like that, especially in the school budget world, is that you don't know when you're going to be able to get additional funds from the state, and you don't know when they're going to be able to have the dollars. So you have to be a little opportunistic to take advantage of that when you can. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Because I just remember that being part of a conversation before when we've said maybe we should look at pausing.
Well, and Steve, I guess I would add, just kind of while we're talking about the numbers, is also the fact of, with the current AFFO legislation and what we've seen by way of development or in some respects lack thereof, that's going to be another, layer on this, that if you've got revenue increasing by 1%, but if you've got expenses continuing to increase at another, but yet you're doing things to slow down development, you're not bringing in the same revenue as well. So I think the other part of this conversation, whether it's development holistically or even speaking specifically on the business side, and perhaps having some type of notation as to what do we do in terms of trying to drive more private industry, which ultimately impacts the top line, as opposed to obviously talking about what we need to cut or perhaps what fees we need to raise.
Yes.
It's in speaking about the schools too, one of the things we talked about on a broader scale is that we have to look at what our commercial development's realistically going to look like in whatever our new normal evolves to be. In the same way, school capacity was defined according to old staffing ratios and on uses that may be evolving. And so making a concerted effort to reassess where we think we really will be with development and growth and what that impact will be, it seems to me to be something important to at least advise that we look at.
Another question, and I don't know if we at least, and I guess maybe Holly, this might be a question for you if this is at least alluded to, but just going to Ellen's comments as we talk also just in an overall, state of, just growth and development. Obviously we're in the mix right now of Plan 2040 and looking at devising this new comp plan. And I know one of the conversations that we've had on that advisory group is we've also reached a place as a county truly where we've got to have a conversation about at the end of the day, where do we go in the sense of, are we truly trying to grow, or rather and if so, how do we grow? Or do we take kind of just no growth? And it's not so much to say that it's at this point not putting one being better than the other, but ultimately making a decision because we've kind of reached the fork in the road. And so I think in some respects, what comes out of those planning efforts obviously will have some impact here on spending affordability because of the fact that it's dealing with growth and some of those things that impact the revenue that's generated. And lastly, I think, when we think about on the commercial side, going back to Ellen's points, we've seen how much it takes to grow that commercial digest by the presentation from, EDA and so forth as well.
And
I think,
Holly, this is Joan, and going back to do we have the operating funds to support some of these capital projects? I think the new cultural center this year was probably an example, not that I want necessarily the council weighing in on these issues, but it was an example of where the Rec and Parks had to show that they actually would generate enough revenue to support the expansion of their facilities there. So, I mean, I think that's something that we could take a look at is having some of these departments, show how these capital projects will be supported within the budget. I don't think that's a horrible idea. It does require that they realistically look at how they will plan before the construction actually gets started. So Thank you.
John, I was in a meeting, geez, it feels like almost 8 years ago when that first was starting to get talked about, and there was talk about revenue generation, and unfortunately, no different than the transfer tax issue where there could be variability there. At the end of the day, it's an obligation of the county that's going to come out of the general fund to cover whether or not they hit those projections or not. So it's hard, I think, to, they're not going to shut one facility down because it's not running, and to go into I don't want to get into a long discussion about that, but as we look at the different things that we're doing, I think you need to assume that the operating cost is coming out of the general fund for the purpose of we're building a facility. If it's better than that, great. But when you're planning for it, I think you need to understand that you're subject and you're going to be responsible for all of the operating costs. If something doesn't work out, if events are canceled, if other things aren't running at the same level you thought, the facility still has to be maintained, still has to be run. Debt service is still going to be required to be paid. And I think as we look at these long-term impacts of these projects, knowing what the operating budget impact would be fully loaded for these projects is important as we make these decisions. So it's a very good point. But at the end of the day, it's all responsibility of the county.
I agree with you, Steve. I do think, though, that you can assess whether their projections are realistic or not, given what we know. And clearly this year is evidence that we can't control all of those variables. But given what we know, are they realistic expectations? And I think that's how we always operate.
Okay.
Let me go back to this concept of the structural deficit, because I think that's a term that's easy to just roll off the tongue, but I don't think anybody really knows what it means. And maybe I think it would be helpful for us to make some things concrete. So, for example, looking back to the infrastructure presentations that we had, last year they were granted 3.8 million of the 21 requested, and over the last 3 years, my notes say they requested 63 million. 36 million would have kept to the PCI level, the road quality index level, and they were only funded 23 million, which means that we already have a degradation of $13 million that has degraded the PCI level, that's working against us, and we've underfunded their request by $40 million just in the last 3 years. That's what structural deficit means. And unless the political powers that be say that, well, that's okay. I mean, we want them to say, we're making our value judgment and we're going to underfund that, and the quality of the roads and the other infrastructure will deteriorate, and we're okay with that. But I think just calling it a structural deficit lets everybody just pretend that that nothing's happening. That a structural deficit just means that at some point in the future, we might have to make some cuts. The reality is we're making cuts now. We're seeing the results of those cuts on the margins, but it's going to continue to degrade unless we step up and deal with it. And I think by calling it a structural deficit, nobody really knows what that means. Nobody knows that that's real money that hasn't been spent on things like roads and bridges and sewers that needs to be spent, but we're choosing to spend it elsewhere.
Well, Todd, I agree with you that it's probably a term that most people have been hearing for years, so they just ignore it. But you can see from the presentation that Holly did last week, where she showed the projected revenue and the needs. Some of those were requests, but some of those, to your point, roads and other things, were needs, and that's the deficit right there on an annual basis. So every year we're making, you use the word, value judgments on, can we not spend on this so that we can use the dollars to spend on this? And especially when it comes to other infrastructure projects, and we can, obviously we talked about the detention center, but you just brought up roads and other things. When you don't spend on those, you start to get, I guess, beyond the point of repair and maintenance, and you get to where you don't get the useful life out of a project or a road, and then you have to redo it completely, and you've just wasted money. That's the discussion we had about the courthouse. That's why that's why the county decided to go through the
P3.
P3. Sorry, I've been dealing with the SBA PPP for the last year, so it's another P3. But you have the P3 because it's going to give us a building for 30 years, and as long as those payments are made and maintenance is held and the other party holds up to the end of the agreement that they have, we'll have a building that should last another 30 years beyond that if we take care of it. And so we have a history in this county. And I like what Leonardo was saying of we think growth, because that's where we are. But we're at a point in time in the presentation for planning and zoning shows you we're a much slower growth county than we were 10 years ago, significantly slower growth county than we were 20 years ago, and we're still adding facilities and schools and other things at a rate of new for that super growth, and we're not taking care of the old that a county that's probably on a slower growth maintained standpoint should take. I think that's what you're saying, kind of, Todd. We're making value judgments over let's maintain and keep things so that we don't have to continue to invest bigger dollars down the road.
But Steve,
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing some of that right now with, I mean, the detention center is a great example, and the roads are great examples. If we don't spend money in our operating budget to maintain things as they should be maintained, if we do that over a long enough period of time, then all of a sudden we turn annual maintenance expenditures into a capital project, and then we fund them because we don't have any other way to catch up. So by not maintaining the detention center for an extended period, now all of a sudden we've got to create a capital project and borrow $10 million. By not maintaining the roads on an annual basis, now we're getting further and further and further behind, and we're going to have to do a capital project for $30 million to catch up. And then we'll be paying for that for the next 20 years. So it's that connection between the structural deficit resulting in the move toward additional capital projects because we're not doing what we need to do on an operating basis.
and Steve and Todd, I think part of this is that we've been talking about prioritizing our wants, that we put those out there. But what we're really saying is our needs are now exceeding our wants. If we don't take care of those needs, we're going to be paying for this stuff over and over, and it's going to impact the operating budget in an even more significant way than if we'd taken care of those needs along the way. So we've neglected need in favor of wants, and we need to get back on the road to assessing those more honestly and effectively.
Well, if you go back to what Dr. Cook said just a few minutes ago, where, and Holly was clear, the repairs we're going to do over the next couple of years to the detention center are going to get us 10 years. We're going to issue 20-year money to get 10 years.
Yeah.
And that's kind of summing up all of these points that everybody's making is it's just.
I would like to say, I go back to that we really need to do a better job of communicating with the whole county population. We have a very kind of demanding population that we can spend, it's always, if you can't do it in Howard County, where can you do it? And I think that we haven't really put forward that maintenance concept that really needs to be really strongly said. I can't. Our report is a great thing, but if it sits on the shelf without being communicated to the general population, it's a hard one.
And Barbara, this is Joan. I have to agree with you. You came several times to ACS in the past and presented, and I think many people who consider themselves very well informed were so much better informed, and I hear their conversations now. So for instance, when people go to the county executive's budget hearing, who are those people? And this committee or a subset of them should probably be presenting some of the reasoning behind this report to that group. That is a group who's already weighed in and say that they care. So I don't know. I think you're right about targeted education.
And I think when budget conversations are happening at the school or wherever, we could have somehow this report reference back to the maintenance of what we have and the cost of putting, you know, the operating costs on a new building. I think there's a whole bigger conversation that's not being had, and we need to somehow encourage that conversation. I mean, I think that needs to be a part of the report, frankly.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, great dialogue on the bond authorization recommendation, and I'm taking notes of other things that you would like to see in the report, which is great. So, do we have anyone who wants to make a motion on an authorization recommendation for fiscal year 2022?
I'll make a motion for 50 million on the bond level, the general operation bond level.
But before we do, can I ask one quick question? And I think Holly, maybe you can answer. Is there any kind of in the pipeline that is expected to be included in this year's bond authorization? What projects?
So, okay, so two things. The committee versus the budget itself. The committee is mostly charged about the dollar amount, not allocating to individual projects there. What would be approved by the county council in the final budget is tied to individual project, because the council, when they approve it, they approve individual project level total budget.
But they authorize the full project when they authorize a project, correct?
Correct, right.
So this is.
But the authorized level fund was only the amount in that year's budget. So sometime if the project going multiple years there, but a lot of them, you know, because you need the majority of the funding in order to bid. So that year, it's not necessarily all the project costs in that 1 year, but whatever budget that year, if it's authorized, then the bond can be issued later when the construction.
Yeah, if you're signing a construction contract for a school, you need to have the full authorization for that up front.
Yes, pretty much when you do the bid, you kind of need to have a construction cost.
So
I guess that's
actually Todd's point. There aren't any projects that are sitting there 3/4 of the way done that are going to be part of the recommendation this year. This would be potential new projects coming on board. Is that what you're trying to say, Todd?
Yeah, well, I guess where I'm going is if the council, for instance, thinks that, you know, there are 4 projects that they really, really want, and they think that that's what they're trying to include in this year's capital budget. I worry a little bit about us becoming irrelevant if we go in with a number of 35 or 50 and the council has already in their mind identified 4 projects that are 120. Because, you know, now we're like, they read the report or they hear of the report and they say, well, they recommended 35. What are they smoking? We've already got 110 spent in our heads.
Well, but I think that's the point.
I'm not saying that we bow to that demand necessarily, but I think we do have to be thinking about maintaining our relevance as a recommending committee.
And can I step in real quickly and say something?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, you're talking about the county council, but I think you're giving them a little bit you're talking about power that they really don't have. They can only look at what the county executive brings to them. They can't add to it. So if the county executive brings a $50 million budget, they can't add to the $50 million budget. So it's really the county executive that you guys need to be talking to, I think, not so much the county council. So whether or not the council's got something in their head, if the county executive's not funding it, it really doesn't matter. And one other comment I wanted to make real quickly, you know, because I wanted to make sure that everyone knows the budget office does look at the operating expenses. As if you go to the operating, to the capital book, they have a operating budget impact, and like the 50+ center, they're talking about $600,000 a year, but that does exclude the debt service on the project.
Yeah,
But
thank you for clarification. That's accurate too.
Right.
So yeah, Craig, thank you for that. It's good clarification on both the operating expenses, but also the way that the system works. And Todd, to your point, I think we would we risk more, I guess, looking at it being irrelevant if we have conflicting discussion in there. It's like we're going to put language in here about the need to be constrained, and then say, okay, well, you wanted to do 100 million. Okay, here's 100 million. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I think what we're trying to say is, and maybe we can put language in it, is that bond author recommendation is X, and that should be, and not that we can drive this, right? We don't drive policy decisions. That's what the county executive and the council does. We're just looking at the information and providing recommendations. But that those dollars be used for things that are most pressing and most needed.
But
Steve, if I may, if I could add just a comment, this is Jahanta with the school system, just to Todd's question about, just priorities that may already be there. I do feel like an acknowledgement of projects that are already underway, and what would happen to those projects if the bond authorization was reduced might be good to consider, just to have that as an acknowledgement. That's just my sort of feedback on what would happen to the bonds that were issued for projects that began last year. And if there's not enough authorization to continue those construction projects. I know with the school system, we've got the 3 major projects that are under construction. And then the county has projects as well that would feed into that. And I see Dr. Wu from the board with this.
Aren't those fully authorized at the time
Yeah.
that they started?
Yes.
When they're issued, but so that's why we have $400 million or almost $500 million in authorizations. This is adding to that pool of authorizations.
Okay. So to clarify, I think it's conceptually, it is why it's a kind of like a complex issue is a lot of new projects need big chunk of money authorization to start the real work, like construction, etc. Some already have like planning money, some other pieces there, design, etc. But a big chunk of construction money is still not there to get them where they need to be. But these are technically a large portion of the new ask this year. Cross-board are majority are new projects. They're not first time shown in the book that way. So some of the early stage discussion the prior couple of years, plus some seed money for planning, design, or even early kind of discussion that has already happened. So that's why the dilemma about how to phrase it in a way. But I think the other thing is what I think, Todd, to your point is it's also a messaging issue, right? I mean, from the elected officials, they are voted jointly to make decision based on value judgment for the community. At the same time, the Spending Affordable Committee, I think, as residents advisory body, is to, based on your analysis and observation, is based your own best judgment, provide advice, and then that will be very helpful in informed decision making. I wouldn't say it's linked with reality, because I think what you see is what's the issues happening. So I think what you say and do is adding value, and I think to many people's point today, there's a lot of outreach needs to be happening in order to help people understand the consequence on different. These are tough decisions, the trade-offs there, because new projects are in demand and some are already in the process of starting, are ready to shovel ready, actually, right? And based on a lot of communities' demands in the past many years and to where they are now. On the other hand, the funding is unfortunately not enough to support all of them at the same time. So that was the dilemma we are in currently.
Shovel ready is not shovel in the ground.
Steve,
And I don't want to cut off the conversation, but we do need to vote on this. We've got more items to get through in our time frame. So Milton, this will be the last comment on this before we make a motion.
No, my only point will be quick, and I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but I think we just don't attach the dollar value to any project. All we're doing is authorizing more money to be added
Exactly.
for a day when decisions will be made, and some priorities have to be made based on the dollars available.
Yes, we are not, our report will not have any comments around the projects that those dollars should be used. It's just a recommendation of, hey, we think you shouldn't issue more than X, and you figure out as how it should be spent and what projects it should be allocated towards.
Right.
But if,
A motion on the table for 50 million. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
I second Barbara's motion.
Thank you. Any against? Okay. All right. The next item for the discussion is the analysis of long-term fiscal outlook. So on the screen here is a snippet from Holly's presentation with the preliminary multi-year general fund projections, which range from 2.3 to 2.7. Long run looks 0.4%, if you will, for revenue growth over the next few years. Typically, what we have done here is basically said, hey, we think for your long run models, you should use a percentage, based on what we're seeing in the discussion we're having, and we put a percentage in there. And then we've talked about the things that are below here, which are the gaps in the projected revenue and expenditures. So, that's going back to that whole structural deficit or deficits, whatever you want. We can't, obviously in the county, we can't do deficit spending. We have to have a balanced budget every year. It's just when you balance the budget, you move priorities and potentially put bigger costs out in future years. So anybody have a recommendation that they'd like to move forward with on a percentage for long-term fiscal revenue growth?
I have a question on revenue growth.
Yes.
So my concern, the revenue growth is kind of something we're not able to control. How can we make a really realistic projection there?
So what we're doing here is we're making an informed decision based on the information that Holly and her team have on what the expected revenue growth is based on tax growth, population growth, all the different factors that we've all seen as a committee to say, we think it's around here. I think last year the recommendation from the committee was 2%.
Yeah.
Yes, last year the committee chose to just take an even more conservative approach. Historically, most years stay with what the budget office projected, just based on best information at that point.
And that was because I think we saw a year where it was 1.7% growth or something like that is what was actually achieved in one of the previous years. So we were trying to be a little more conservative for the long run growth. So did that answer your question?
I see. I think then we take those suggestions, maybe that's what we know.
I couldn't hear you. Sound a little muffled. Could you get closer to your mic?
I think maybe we did take the suggestions from Holly, and that's the number.
So the 2.4%. So we have a recommendation to do. Is that a motion to do 2?
I couldn't make an motion. I'm not a voting member.
Oh, okay.
I'll make a motion, Richard Clinch, for 2.2 to kick off debate.
I will second that because I tend to go more conservative.
I agree.
Okay. Do we have
Support.
Opposed? All right. So we'll go with the recommendations. I'm
fine with that too, but I do have one question about these 2 bullet points underneath this chart. Or
yes,
I don't think they follow from the chart.
Yes.
Increased debt burden has nothing to do with revenue.
No, but the other part that wasn't on this chart, Todd, was I cut them off, and that's on me, was the expense projections that were here as well.
Okay. Yep. All right.
From Holly's presentation, and that goes back to that whole structural deficit discussion that we had.
Right.
So if I can pull that up if you want to see it.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay. So now we move into other findings and recommendations, and here are just some thoughts. Again, I think we have a theme: expense control, operating budget, and here it's some language around working with the agencies and the education entities to reduce requests and balance the needs of all needs of the county. I think sometimes certain priorities overshadow other needs as well, especially ones that are significant portions of the budget. Discussion, just a discussion, and I'd like to talk about this one, discussion of funding above MOE for the school system, and exploring innovative approaches to service delivery. Anybody have any thoughts on putting language in the report on holding funding to MOE for the school system?
I definitely feel we need to really and originally fund the school system. So I'm not sure what that sentence means, because, for example, this year
the sentence means do not fund more than what's required.
I think that's kind of not fair. And
when you're spending almost 2/3 of your budget on one line, I think that's where it goes into the balancing all the needs of the county. And,
sure.
and as you saw from the presentation, the school system's request is more than what the expected revenue growth is for the year.
But I would say that look at that a different way. So, for example, our budget our revenue is kind of very unique, right? 90% comes from the personal income and the residential or property tax. When people move in the Howard County, that's one reason, because the school system, people are not able to sufficiently fund us in terms of school quality and the reputation. If that goes down, both 90% of revenue will go down. And I don't think that will put down for our county budget.
And just to add to what Dr. Wu said, this is Jahanta Siddiqui with the school system. MOE would essentially be roughly a $17 million reduction for the appropriation to the school system from the FY21 level. So it would be a cut that we would have to absorb into our budget somehow, if that is what the recommendation is. And at this point, the state has not issued an MOE number. That 17 million is based on our estimate. There would also be the implication of, we had the discussion a couple weeks ago about the Curvin funding and the governor's budget. The governor in his proposed budget has a clause in the legislation that requires for local school districts to be able to get the hold harmless funding that the governor has put into the budget. There's a clause that requires local county governments to also increase funding from FY21 and going into FY22 as a condition of receiving that hold harmless funding. So if the MOE is a recommendation, I just want to make sure the committee is aware that we would also lose the hold harmless funding that the governor has proposed.
Additional funding.
It's the hold harmless funding. So the hold harmless funding is for the enrollment growth, so as well as the Curvin funding that the governor would be continuing. As we had shared during our presentation, there's about $33 million that if we're not held harmless for the enrollment growth and also for the Curvin legislation having been vetoed, we would lose that funding and so that would be the total cut that the county would have to contend with.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. We are already one of the highest tax burden counties in the state on an individual basis when it comes to personal income tax and real estate tax. So to make an argument that the quality of our schools would suffer when we're already funding at from a tax standpoint higher than, I think it's 21 of the other counties in the state on a percentage basis of income. and we are a very, very highly taxed population. And the only way to increase funding is to increase taxes or increase growth. We just had a conversation that growth is slowing. The growth that we have doesn't provide as much funding as the growth that we received over the past 20 years because of the type of growth that it is. So we're at an inflection point for funding, and it's similar to the conversation that we have around structural deficit. To Todd's point, when we talk revenues, sometimes maybe we get a little lost in the fact that that's taxes, and that's money out of our population and our citizens' pockets, and so there's a lot of competing interests in this county, and I agree that we want good schools, but we need to weigh all of our needs, and that's basically what this is saying. Is if we're going to fund above MOE, and it could be for any reason, it could be for what was just laid out, we need to understand that that comes at the price of other things. We can't do it all unless we raise taxes or we find other sources of tax revenue from growth or fees or other things, but they need to be repeatable. Like one-time fees, variable fees, those don't help us here. We're talking about operating expenses which aren't variable. They typically only go up. So I think the discussion around expense controls in the operating budget, we can craft language for the committee that is clear, that when we make a decision, especially when it comes to a budget line item as large as the school system, it starts to impact the other needs of the county.
And can I jump in there?
Yes, Todd.
Yeah, I'd like to make this real and concrete if we can, because I think it gets lost in, this percentage increase here and there, and everybody's like, their eyes glaze over. The reality is, let's just make it simple. Let's say the schools represent 2/3 of the county budget. Which means that if growth is 2.5% and the schools get a 3% increase, then everything else has to have a 1% decrease to pay for the school's 0.5% increase above the 2.5%, because there's a leverage effect with the schools getting 2/3 of the county budget. So I think that gets lost, that reality of the size of the school's budget. And if the schools get an increase bigger than our growth, that means everything else has to pay for it. And everything else has to pay for it at a price of 2 times the percent of the school's growth, because the schools are 2/3 of the budget.
Todd, that's
I agree with that
way to outline it.
And Steve, this is Joan again, and I'm going to beat a dead horse here kind of, but I think this is where our outreach comes out. We talk among ourselves, and I think we all understand the trade-offs. What the public doesn't necessarily understand, they keep saying they come for the schools, they come for the amenities, but they don't understand that if they want those to continue, that we will continue to be the highest taxed county, and that it will require an increase because you can't have it all. And so I think we write this report, but I don't think as many people read it as should. And so I think that begs for more outreach.
So Joanne, Todd, and Steve, I agree with your point. So the problem for the MOE for this year is because the student enrollment dip. That is not a really regular situation. It's very abnormal. So that's the reason I don't support this on this one, because this year is better. So,
I understand what you're saying. It's an anomaly because the for MOE would be a negative.
Yeah.
But to be clear, every year for the last forever, since it's been in place, the school has asked for more than MOE.
So approval amount actually.
But that's a fact, right?
Yeah, I agree. So
we've been funding greater. I mean, we wouldn't be. It's fine. I think we understand where the language needs to be from the voting members, and we'll craft something that we'll work into the report.
So I think I want to make another point. Another point is like the reason actually I support MOE, right? The problem is, as I said, the number is of a normal. That's the problem for this year. And the other question I would say, we really need to design our spending. So we have a lot of like big spending. For example, the Alex City spending is on the plan, more than $100 million. Is that the plan we're moving forward? And because this is a climate change and the overdevelopment on the top of the hill, changes landscape. So we need to look at that again, and whether because in the past we spent a lot of money, millions of dollars with the flood.
How much are we? Well, how much are we spending on? I mean, we can get into a deeper discussion, and I'd love to have a conversation with you one-on-one if you'd like. How much are we spending less per pupil than our peers?
No.
Reasonably at the same level.
Yeah. So the argument that all of this growth that happened that we're not able to keep up. Peers are spending. Is your suggestion we should be spending significantly more?
No, I think right now in terms of school system, per student spending, we are really comparable to other neighboring countries. We're not much higher or much lower. We're at the upper level, but we're not number one. I would say that. Right? So if you look at number per student spending.
Okay, but we're not 24th.
We are probably number 4 over 24. Number 4, number 5 over 25.
And how does that place us in the country from a per pupil funding? In the top
10, I
bottom,
think.
in the middle.
Per student spending is not a top 10 because the cost spending is quite different across different states.
Exactly, and our cost of living is really high.
Yeah.
And part of that reason for cost of living really high is our high tax burden. So it's kind of all.
It's a catch too.
Do we have available to us, readily available to us, the percentage of the county budget that is represented by the schools over time? Is there a trend line there that's available?
Yeah, we have that information. But just like for illustration purpose, I think in recent years, the direct appropriation to the school system in the county general fund budget is roughly 52%. If you include the debt service for school capital project as well as the county contribution to the OPEB operating post-employment retiree health benefit, then the total is roughly 58% of the county budget.
Right. It's not 2/3, it's about 60%.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I think we have the language on there that we can put in there, and I think we can craft something. I'd like to talk a little bit about I think we've covered expense controls and expenditure controls. I want to talk a little bit about reserve and one-time funding. So this available money at the end of the year that's used for pay-go funding, and then any one-time funds in order to the catch-up funds that came in this year. How do we have a recommendation as a committee as to how we should recommend that the county spend those dollars? Or is everybody comfortable with the language that's on the slide here?
I really like the long-term planning, how to promote tax-based development. I think the one point I want to really highlight is because Florida County is close to like high-tax companies nearby. How do we promote, maybe just focus on one area, tax development, right? Do some investment, attract more business come to Florida County. That would be something we really focus on. Otherwise, our tax base totally focused on property tax and income tax, which is it's good and bad, but it's not expandable or scalable.
Are you going back to the previous discussion?
No, it's the one year on your long-term planning.
Oh, no, I haven't heard anybody say if we're comfortable with reserve and one-time funding. I haven't got, but I got you. We'll get there in a second.
Oh, I really think we shouldn't use MOU for school this year, because that will we have a huge the school system, especially consider next year when all students come back. That will be a huge problem because it's kind of bubble huge the school system.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Does anybody else have any recommendations on reserve and one-time funding?
It's
This is
Ellen.
Rafi.
Okay, I would say you don't spend one-time funds on continuing expenses, which is pretty obvious. So reduction makes a lot of sense, and not committing to something that continues to cost money.
Steve, this is Joan. We've talked both years that I've been on this committee about the need for more affordable housing. But what we need is some sort of funding stream for that, and maybe to use some of these reserves to start a trust fund that can be used flexibly over the course of many years might be a very valuable use, because we also that will help us as far as attracting businesses. I mean, so it's something to consider.
Okay.
This is JC. That's an interesting idea, and I was just going to say more generally that I think it feels very reasonable this year for us to recommend that the county tap into rainy day funds, particularly if we're recommending otherwise essentially a freeze on spending. It seems like the two go hand in hand.
Well, this is Rafi. Just to quickly highlight, I like the recommendation, because this goes toward the credit rating agencies have been asking for, because if, as you've all heard, we don't meet all their criteria for a AAA, but one of the tools that they strongly reward us for is our rainy day fund, because we've never touched it and they expect us not to touch it. So this would be great to have, because we want to retain that AAA. The cost of borrowing is less, which will enable us to be able to fund most of our projects.
Yeah, it was good to see the increase in the rainy day fund from the money that came in, because it probably helped us in a tough year for ratings, given where we are in the economy.
Yes, we do that, and I think they loved the conversation we had when we met with them.
Yeah, I think they highlighted that actually in our communication.
In their reports.
The importance of maintain and increase the reserve against the unknown. That's actually, they really emphasize that. And also to Ellen's and others' point, I think it's also a really good point about if there's any decision to use a one-time fund per county charter, it needs to be limited to one time, non-recurring expenditure. So not to get into the base, and ideally be used on something to offset otherwise the general fund spending. So that appears to be good points to me.
I think historically what we've learned is that not that we've seen any significant reductions in revenue, but we have seen reductions in revenue, that those usually follow, as you've shown in your presentation, those usually follow the impact to the economy a fiscal year or two later. We'll see that impact as we get through the reassessment process with the housing market and the commercial real estate market, and as you get through personal income tax that a year or two later.
Can I jump in real quick? Two things. One, that somebody's live with a lot of construction sounds in the background or something. But refresh my memory, I don't recall if we had a number provided to us on the incremental cost of being AA versus AAA with respect to new bond issuances. And I'm not an advocate for compromising our AAA, but I would like to know what the costs are, say, per 100 million, the incremental cost of being double versus triple per 100 million, because it's only on on borrowing going forward, not borrowing looking backward. So it impacts us into the future, but not on our existing issuances.
That is true. I'll have to give you, they don't have not just a dollar value to the incremental $100. There are a number of factors that they look into to downgrade it to a AA and for you to be a AAA. What a AAA means is that is the best, which means all your financial management and policies are in order, that the leadership team are really working together to make sure that they address all the issues that come up within the county. And as you know, there are less than 50 counties out of about 3,100 that are AAA from all three rating agencies. It's very difficult.
Right.
So
I think we understand that, and we applaud you and the team for the efforts to do that. I think what Todd's saying is the difference between AA and AAA is a dollar amount in how much we have to pay in interest.
And we talk, yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to do is we talk about kind of cavalierly almost saying that, well, if we maintain our AAA, it allows us to borrow at the most cost-effective rates. It's like, well, yeah, I know that, but the reality is if we're authorizing $100 million a year, if we have to issue that $100 million at a AA rate rather than a AAA rate, a very specific dollar amount. And my question is, what is that specific dollar amount?
Yeah, Todd, I think finance can find it out, but however, it really depends on interest rate environment.
Yes.
Sometimes interest rate is 5% versus 2 or 3% market, then the spread will be very different, right? So that's one point. We can find that information, but that's just something to keep in mind because the different.
Are you saying that there's a different risk premium?
Yeah, the interest because the rate spread will be different between.
The spread should be relatively the same. The difference would be the market rates, and that would be your adjustment. But your risk premium is your risk premium.
Yeah, I mean the reality is if it's 10 basis points difference, it's one thing. If it's 50 basis points differential, it's another. So I'm trying to put a number to it.
Yeah, we'll
get you. Yeah,
we'll find out.
50 basis points. We'll get up to 50, but we'll find out. We'll
find that information, and we can bring back. But the other thing is that AAA is not the only purpose to just save, because that's a very important indicator about the whole county's financial management, long-term ability to pay the debt, long-term economic base, the overall management level. So it's a very strong indicator about the county's overall well-being financially, not only today, but also in the next 20 years that you are able to. So it's really.
Does it impact other things other than bond issuance? Does it impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of business community, they will look at that to know whether you're a well-managed county, and also it's a county with future, because you can afford 20 years from now, not only today. So that's a very important comprehensive indicator beyond just to save money. That's obviously the first.
I don't want to. Beyond that. We'll get to Todd. I don't want to hijack this discussion on the value of AAA over AA or anything like that, but
I did have one.
That number, that'd be great.
This is Pete. My question is, how much money are we talking about for at a 50% level, and why not 40% or 60%? How do we pick 50%?
I think we had recommended that years ago. It just hadn't been put in the report in a while. The number varies. It depends on what's kind of left over at the end of the year, the surplus from the prior year. So if it's $20 million surplus, we're saying put 10 away and you can spend 10. If it's $30 million, 15 and 15. If it's 8, 4 and 4.
So I have
a lot of times road money
question. I have a quick clarification question. When you're talking rainy day fund, are you talking about the budget stabilization account, which at the moment is pretty restricted on how you can use it and having to pay back into it? Or are you just talking about keeping it aside in the fund balance somewhere that's less restricted?
I think, don't we have a goal to get the rainy day fund to a certain percentage?
Well, according to the charter, we're only required to put 7% of total general fund expenditures for the last completed fiscal year, which we do. We don't put any more in than that.
So there's so rainy day fund has been used in different ways. The broad rainy day fund means just kind of like you set aside not to use it. The county's charter, there's so-called stabilization fund. That's 7%. Try to amend it as Craig just mentioned. And on top of that, the county establish a policy fund. On top of that, that's also kind of a broad, I guess. I think the rainy day fund is trying to.
This is not the stabilization fund. This is just reserves, general reserves.
Okay,
Right.
just kind of set aside, I think what you're saying.
Yeah,
right. So the term rainy day fund is commonly the name that people call the budget stabilization account. So I don't know.
Well, we can change that to unallocated reserves.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So we'll change that then, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Just kind of make a technical change to the term, basically.
Okay, on to long-term planning. This is more of just some commentary to add into the report around, I mean, one thing we've talked about in previous years and want to continue the dialogue, and I think it's gotten better, is bringing all of the stakeholders to the table. And Joan, I would say probably one of the groups that's not brought to the table on a regular basis in the long-term planning discussion, other than when we're going through like a general plan update, is the public, right? We're not doing enough conversations around what does our long-term fiscal plan look like, so that all stakeholders can have a voice in making sure that we're planning it appropriately. And the idea here was, for years, stuff was coming in and asked, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this, not weighing each agency, each group's needs against the other to say, well, we have to plan this out over a horizon, and everybody can't get everything they need today. But kind of developing that long-term strategic and fiscal plan with all stakeholders is more language that there needs to be a better form for it.
I'd like to add the word prioritize in that statement somehow. Prioritize our needs.
Okay.
I think it says it clear.
Okay. There's been a lot of discussion in this particular spending affordability committee, and even today, times about ways to promote commercial tax-based development.
Can I jump in here on this?
Absolutely.
I think kind of intuitively, we all feel the same way, and I certainly did too, with respect to promoting commercial tax-based growth as much as possible. But I don't have it in front of me, but I sent out an email, and one of my questions was, if you use the numbers that have been provided with respect to how much land is allocated in the county or used in the county for residential, how much land is used for commercial, to my really big surprise, commercial is twice as land consumptive per its base than residential, and which was totally counterintuitive, and I don't have an answer to that yet. So I'm going back to this bullet point saying, well, we're intuitively thinking that it makes sense to promote commercial growth, but do the land numbers really support that conclusion as the way to maximize our tax base per acre remaining to develop?
But isn't it, so obviously things would change, and Larry, you could jump in here.
Yep.
If something you want to say, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I would say there's also a cost side of that as well. I mean, generally speaking, your commercial base consumes less services than a residential property would. So while it might consume more land, it's probably also on a dollar for dollar basis generating more revenue.
Yeah. This is Richard. I would echo two things on that. One, is Howard County's on a kind of land use change, just like we're on an inflection point in population growth. I think, Larry, tell me if you disagree, but the patterns of employment development in the county to date have been more land intensive per job because we haven't had high densities. So most of our office, most of our is 2 to 3 stories, not higher. So future growth is going to, because of land shortages, going to be higher. So the answer is that's a standard pattern as a county develops its economy, that you get, fewer jobs per square foot or per acre, the less developed you are, and you get more as you develop, as you get more dense. And the second issue I'll echo is for Larry. I don't remember the numbers if we did this in the study for APFO. Well, I just did it for Prince George's County, but every job generates 1/3 or less than 1/2 of the demands of county government in that county than a resident. So both points, we have a less intensive land use, or more intensive land per job that's changing and will change, and also commercial does pay for itself many times fold for what Larry said.
Right. So then it really kind of hammers home Josh's point, and one that we raised last year, which is we have to look at parking ratios, we have to look at building height, and that needs to be part of the consideration on how we build out the remaining commercial land, and then secondly, how we redevelop existing developed commercial land.
Right. Yeah, Todd, you're exactly right. That's why, we have been talking about Gateway for a number of years now as, it's a redevelopment opportunity. I mean, we'd had the luxury in the past of being able to spread out and build a lot of single story, buildings there, but there is over 200 acres of surface parking in Gateway and only 150 acres of rooftop in the commercial, on the commercial side. So, obviously we've had the luxury of spreading out. Now we have to start going up. And, part of that is, how do we promote redevelopment? Redevelopment is very difficult because you have to either tear down or add on. And how do we incentivize that, promote that? Because it really is our, only viable option.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to hammer that home this year again.
Yeah.
One thing that I see is the eternal battle between the environment and commercial. And if we had more environmentally sound commercial planning, we may be able to do more. For example, pervious commercial parking could be something to consider, but like a long-term strategy to see whether or not we can have the commercial not be as anti-forest, agriculture as it is seen right now. I think that could be somewhere where we could find a lot more commercial land if we had, if it was more seen as environmentally positive.
Well, I think, no developer wants to do the amount of parking that's required by the regulations now, because it never gets used. I mean, we all know that. You drive anywhere, any commercial location, how often do you see cars in the vast majorities of those parking lots, in the outer reaches of those parking lots? They're never, ever used. But those parking spaces are provided because they're required by regulation. There's nothing more anti-environment than asphalt, and that asphalt is required by the county.
Yeah.
So I agree. I think working to change the ratios to a more responsible number where parking is actually utilized is not only a good thing from a land consumption metric, but also from an environmental metric.
Yeah.
Yeah, like pervious pavers, like I mentioned before, are clearly more expensive, but your water runoff could significantly be reduced as well. They're same with where you have more open areas for trees. Right now, we the clumping that we do may not be a 100-year plan, but more based on engineering. I think we're looking at most of the layouts very much from an engineering only point of view and not married with other needs, and really a 100-year plan. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or thoughts on long-term planning?
Just to add on to the the redevelopment, Steve, just one comment is, we also have to take a look at, how are we encouraging it, promoting it, and enabling it as it, compares to our competition regionally, because, businesses, companies, developers have choices, and they're going to go where it's encouraged and welcomed, not, stiff-armed. So it's just I think a consideration we have to put into context of regionally, how are we positioned to encourage it and welcome it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the ways to, we talked earlier, it's one of the ways to grow revenue without necessarily having the same impact on the expense side.
It's that repeatable revenue that you were talking about.
Yep. Okay. I'd like to include in the report again this year. I know we were able to get to a longer committee meeting, but I really do think this committee, and I think what you're saying, and again, Barbara and Joan have said this, having it meet more regularly would also give us the ability to have the more recommendations for people to watch the meetings, to be involved in the meetings, to listen in, and then maybe part of that annual piece will be us going around and setting up some presentations of the report after the fact. And I remember doing a few of those a number of years ago. We haven't done them in the last few years, but those do help, because I think a lot of people understand what they read, but if they don't read the report, they don't get to understand the things that we're all seeing and talking about. So, does anybody have any other recommendations they'd like to see in the report that we haven't outlined here? Okay. All right, so our upcoming schedule, there won't be a meeting next Thursday. We're going to be working on the report. We will have a draft report to the committee by 3 o'clock on the 22nd, and we will have our meeting to vote on that report on the 25th at 7 a.m. So the team that's helping draft the report will be meeting between now and then. And we will get that report to everybody on the 22nd. That will give you a couple of days to review it and come prepared to the meeting then on it, so that we can vote on it. So I appreciate everybody's dialogue this morning. I thought this was a great discussion, one of the better ones we've had over the years. So thank you for that. And I think we are good to go. Holly, do you have anything you want to add?
Not really. Thank you very much. I think it's a really great discussion. And then just for logistics, there for folks that if you want to refresh the memory on today's, or if anyone of the committee that missed it, it will be posted online usually a couple business days after today. So you will still have a chance to replay the video if you want to catch all the emphasize or all discussion today. Thank you. I think we'll see everybody two weeks from now, right?
All right. Have a good one.
Thank you. And thank you, Steve, for chairing the meeting. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.